Yes, hello to everybody. My name is Olivier Micol. I'm the head of the data protection unit in the DG Justice in the European Commission. And I am extremely pleased to be with you today on Data Protection Day. As Vice President Jourova and Commissioner Render said this morning, privacy is part of Europe DNA. And this year is also the 40th anniversary of the Council of Europe Convention 108. So it's a very important year, a very important day. And one of the key topic really discussed in the context of data protection is really the role of algorithm, the role of artificial intelligence. And to discuss these topics this afternoon, we have the chance of having a great panel with four distinguished panelists. First, Jennifer Cobbe from the University of Cambridge. And Jennifer will bring to us this afternoon, of course, the academic and research focus. She's a research associate and affiliated lecturer in the Department of Computer Science and Technology in Cambridge, and she's part of the Compliant and Accountable Systems Research Group. So very important background for us this afternoon. She's looking at issues like trust and distrust about internet technology, society and power. And she works in a computer science department, but she has also a law background. So she has got everything needed for today's panel. We will also have the chance of having Matthias Spielkamp, founder and executive director of Algorithm Watch. I'm sure you're all familiar with Algorithm Watch, with a non-profit research and advocacy organization looking at algorithmic decision. He has been testifying in front of committees of the Council of Europe, or the European Parliament, the German Bundestag. So he has written books and on automation of society and internet governance. So here he will bring, Algorithm Watch is one of these organizations. We keep the government and authorities, on their guard by their active work of advocacy and looking at what everything can go wrong, basically. We will also have the chance of having Ger Baron, the Chief Technology Officer of the City of Amsterdam. And with Ger, we get a very close look at how to put things in practice, how things are working, how things are working on the ground. Ger is a member of the Future Cities Council at the World Economic Forum, and is now working on redesigning the government and execute programs in every domain that the City of Amsterdam is working, from mobility to cyber security, energy, or social services. So really a very close look at what happened on the ground and a very practical experience. And last but not least, we are also extremely pleased to have Cornelia Kutterer, Senior Director, Rule of Law and Responsible Tech at Microsoft. So many of you know Cornelia for a very long time. So I don't know if it's necessary to introduce her, but she's a senior director, as I said, and she has been working for years on the impact of new technology and regulatory framework, so that this development, meet the needs and expectation of the users. She has her teams cover policies such as responsible AI, trust, ethical AI, digital safety, privacy, lawful access, human rights, and competition. So I think Shares here again with Cornelia. We have a very knowledgeable and experienced panelist to discuss about responsible AI. So I think with this great panel, we will be able to deal with the very challenging topic today of algorithm-assisted decision-making. Just to say a few words as an introduction on the ongoing work in the Commission. As you all know, the Commission has published a white paper in last February, to which several of our panelists have commented on, and maybe a number of the people in the audience as well. So the objective is to have this legislative proposal coming very soon, still in the first quarter of 21. And really the question here is the protection of fundamental rights and the safety of individuals where artificial intelligence is used, and how to also enhance the enforcement of EU rules. And all the discussion is about this risk-based approach to identify where concrete situations where the risk arise for individual. And the whole narrative is built about this human-centric approach to AI, and of course, data protection and the GDPR and the law enforcement directive have a key role to play in this respect. As you know, GDPR will apply to AI every time personal data will be processed. So all the panoply of the whole rules of the GDPR, whether it's purpose limitation, storage accuracy, the principle of accountability, the very important principle of fairness. So all the panoply of GDPR will apply. And also, of course, the GDPR has specific rules which are particularly important for algorithm, the Article 22, for instance, on the automated decision making. So the principle also of transparency is key, because we know that AI, in many instances, is considered as a black box, which can be a challenge for the implementation, for the enforcement of data subject rights. So these are all topics I think that we will be discussing this afternoon. The accountability, the testing, how to ensure supervision, and without further ado, I would like to explain how we are going to work this afternoon on these topics. Each of the panelists will have 5 minutes presentation, and then we will engage into a debate. And in the meantime, you are very much advised to send your question, and we will try to take as many of them as possible in order to have a lively debate. But first, then I would like to start with the kind of more holistic academic view on the topic, and I would like to pass the floor to Jennifer.
Brilliant, thank you. So I think, first of all, I'll say that I'm primarily interested in automated decision in the welfare and social security programs, or the so-called digital welfare state, because that's where I think most of the danger is and where most of the risk to vulnerable people arises, and that's where I think we need to be most concerned about. I think it's really important to understand the increasing use of automated decision-making in those areas of government in its context. Reforms in the public sector of many countries over the last few decades introduced market logic deep into public administration, emphasizing competition and private management and performance metrics and efficiency and cost saving, perhaps above all. And into this mix has more recently come a sort of quasi-ideological belief in the supposedly transformational power of data gathering and analytics technologies. A lot of questionable assumptions and utopian beliefs about automation's potential to bring increased accuracy, reduce bias, and an improved ability to spot patterns often play into sort of government's automation strategies, particularly those that focus on machine learning systems. In government specifically, however, efficiency and cost saving and unfounded techno-utopian beliefs aren't things that should be prioritised above others. The law and the interests of good government holds other values and other requirements and other standards to be more important. The failure to properly prioritise these values in public sector automation means that negative consequences have begun and will continue to manifest, particularly for the more vulnerable in society, such as those navigating the immigration or welfare system. Indeed, the need to maintain the rule of law and standards of good government is particularly acute, given that it will often be the more vulnerable who will be subject to public sector automated decision making. Across countries, automated systems are already being used in areas including policing, healthcare, social services, child welfare, calculating and paying welfare benefits, risk scoring, and fraud detection. Elsewhere, automation is also used in biometric identity verification, assessing eligibility for welfare and need classification, among other areas of public service. And these are very consequential decisions. The people can't just be treated as data points. The risks to and impact on vulnerable people must be strongly considered in automation. We have to emphasise that efficiency and cost saving are not the be-all and end-all and should not be the overriding priorities in government. There needs to be a wider acknowledgement that doing things properly will sometimes take longer and cost more. And there needs to be an acknowledgement, I think, that in many cases, automated decision-making is not the right approach. Automation and digitalisation programmes must deprioritise those market logics of things like efficiency and cost saving, and they must reprioritise the rule of law, the fundamental principles of good government like democratic legitimacy, public accountability, non-discrimination, and I think most importantly, they have to put human rights front and centre, not just civil and political rights, but socio-economic rights as well. We have to remember, I think, that we operate under the rule of law, not the rule of technology, and the law must remain the reference point. What technology can and can't do mustn't be allowed to become the standard by which we evaluate developments in the public sector. I'm not opposed to automation in the public sector in principle, but I would strongly argue that legislative responses are urgently required to ensure a renewed focus on the rule of law, on human rights, principles of good government in the design, deployment and use of automated decision-making systems in the public sector. And in the meantime, if the technology can't do what the law requires, then the answer is simple: don't use the technology. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So I think that the next speaker will fully agree with what you say on the need to prioritize the rule of law and the social economic rights, and maybe to take a bit more time and to do things a bit more slower, but to do them right. But Matthias, I would like to pass the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Olivier, and also Jennifer for your talk, your introduction. I brought some slides, few ones, but maybe we can see them right now. Okay, thank you very much. So we can go to the next slide immediately. We produced the automating system. I hope many of you have already seen that. We launched last October. And basically, I can reiterate what Jennifer just said. We did a survey of basically 16 European countries. Next slide, please. Where we looked at, next slide, please. Where we looked at examples of how what we call automated decision making, and Jennifer so rightly said, automated decision making for consequential decisions. When we looked at this in 16 different European countries with a lot of resources. We had a team of about 40 people, 30 of them researchers and journalists from all the countries that we studied, and we had a really high level of collaborators here in this attempt. Many of you know the names if you look at the report, because they are also here at the CPD talks and even hosting the conference. So we are pretty optimistic that we are painting a very realistic image of what is going on in Europe, and of the about 105 cases that we looked at, our assumption is, or our assessment rather, not assumption, our assessment is that about 85% of them are not really used to strengthen people's rights and opportunities, but to diminish them or at least are highly problematic. So this underscores what Jennifer already said. Next slide, please. And because that is the case, we conclude that the automated society that we are living in is quite opaque, that we have this fundamental lack of transparency, and we have seen that in all countries that were researched. Next slide, please. So what we are asking for is that, or what we are stating is that most of the times this endemic opacity of these ADM systems is exploited precisely in order to prevent scrutiny. And it means that this automated society was established without any meaningful democratic debates about or around its principles and uses. And as I said, you know, the vast majority of these uses that we recorded tend to put people at risk rather than help them. Next slide. Now, as a consequence, we developed a couple of policy and I can present here. I focused on the most important ones for the CPDP conference here. What is really paramount, in our opinion, is that first of all, we need to increase the transparency of these automated decision-making systems. Now, it has to be clear, it has been said often enough, and of course we are of the same opinion, that transparency is never an end in itself. It can only be a means to an end. And that is to check what these systems are being used for and whether there's enough accountability and whether the values that we should prioritize, as Jennifer so rightly said, are actually prioritized. But to do that, to be able to do that, we need that higher level of transparency. And this is why we are asking to establish public registers for automated decision-making systems that are used within the public sector, introduce binding data access frameworks to support and enable public interest research so that people can actually query those systems and scrutinize them and find out what they are doing. And also, of course, develop and establish approaches to effectively audit these algorithmic systems. Now, that's a Herculean task, as anyone can attest to who's here at CPDP and are dealing with these issues, but we need to start doing it. Next slide, please. If you're interested, have a look at the Automating Society report, and I'll conclude here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I think now we move to really to the practical experience that Ger, as CTO in Amsterdam, has acquired in a wide range of sectors. So, Ger, we are very much looking forward to your introductory remark.
Thank you. And I mean, for us, it's actually twofold. On the one hand, it's using algorithms, automatic decision making for our own purposes. Secondly, we're a city where obviously a lot of companies play a role in the public domain, from health to taxi companies to companies who rent out vacation houses, etc. So for us, it's basically twofold. So on the one hand, we have everything that has to do with automatic decision making for our own purposes, meaning finding ways to detect fraud, finding ways to send people the right way on the road. I mean, who decides where people go to in terms of navigation nowadays? Is this a navigation company, or are we? People expect personalized information, etc. It's also navigating people through systems when applying for welfare or the services we provide. So algorithms are for us actually a tremendous opportunity to improve our services, but on the other hand, we see actually a big problem popping up with algorithms being biased by default. And even our national government has fallen about our national tax authority using algorithms that were discriminating continuously and actually criminalizing people who actually did nothing wrong, based on their family name, based on their background. So we see things happening in Amsterdam in many ways. So for our own purposes, we try to find ways to open up our data, obviously, but also open up our systems. We try to work as much open source as possible. It's not only algorithms, but software in a broad way. And we started, together with the city of Helsinki, we built an algorithm register where we actually start to put in our own algorithms right now, but which is a start also for a register where we actually going to make it mandatory for companies who are active in the public space to put in their algorithms as well. And obviously there are tremendous discussions, what are you opening up for the public, but it should be auditable for in a way that it's transparent enough for us to understand what happened. So, and actually we discovered that a lot of things doing this exercise, that a lot of biases you don't expect. So I fully agree with the first speaker, also the second speaker, that we need to be careful about thinking, oh, for this purpose we can use algorithms. So one of the things we assessed is the system that actually looks at complaints that people put in our city, and they can put a text in the text field, and then we use an algorithm to put the comment to the department actually needs to solve the solution. And then we discovered that people in the rich neighborhoods actually are better in putting in complaints than people in poor neighborhoods in general. So they use better words, they seem to have more time, and they use the word complaint example given. But when you use the word complaint, there's a law that says we actually need to act within 2 weeks. When it's something who senses something or registers something, it's not that important, we need to do something, whatever. But when it's an official complaint, we need to act. So people in rich neighborhoods start to use the word complaint more. Based on that, we actually start to clean certain neighborhoods more often, because we thought there was a lot of stress on the streets because their complaints were better. So people in neighborhoods that were complaint savvy, basically, we start to clean less, and in the complaint savvy neighborhood we start to clean more, because our algorithm told us it's a mess over there, go there, go there, go there. So even something that doesn't have any privacy issues in this perspective, in terms of names or whatever, or ages or whatever you can discriminate on, even these algorithms actually have a bias that actually can lead to more benefits for certain neighborhoods than others in this perspective. So we really try to focus on assessing on algorithms, and on algorithm register.amsterdam.nl, which you can see on the slide. You can actually see a few assessments we did on algorithms, not only doing this, but also looking into what test data is being used in testing the algorithm. So when you talk about object detection, we don't do facial recognition, but we do object detection. What are the test sets being used, example here. So we really try to find a practice. The second thing is that we more and more have conversations with companies, varying from retailers, online retail platforms, to taxi companies, to rental companies for hotels or tourism attractions. We try to work with them and actually make it mandatory for them to open up their algorithm as well, because you see that in a more and more way, these platforms play a dominant role in how public space is being used in a city as Amsterdam. So, and we're in conversation with every navigation company, example. I mean, people used to look at the signs that were at the streets, go left, go right, when you want to go to city center or the parking garage, etc. Nowadays, people watch their Waze, Google Maps, TomTom, here, or any other navigation company's interface to decide when they go left or right. But actually, we want to know what's in the decision making, because in our decision making, we actually try to include schools where people cross the street, where kids cross the street. We try to include elderly homes. We try to include air quality, etc. And this is not something that's in the algorithms being done by mobility navigation companies. So we try to talk to them as well. For hey, please open up your decision making and help us to put air quality, make that a part of your algorithm as well. So I don't want to do the fastest way, etc. So we really try to work now with a lot of companies, and also finding the ways in terms of where's the regulation and what's the discussion. But in the end, I think it will be mandatory for all these companies to open up the algorithms when they want to, when they want to operate in our city at least, to be transparent about it, and then people can have a choice, and we can have the proper discussion about is this a good thing or a bad thing. So for us, it's two things. On the one hand, our own algorithms, where we really need to look at, we assess them all, we put them in a register, and we actually stopped using certain technologies as well, but based on the first speaker as well. I mean, when you don't know what it does, you shouldn't use it. Secondly, more and more we try to apply this also for companies who play a role in the public space or have a big impact on the city in terms of businesses or public space or etc.
Thank you very much, Geir. And to conclude this introductory remarks, then like to pass the floor to Cornelia about the experience of developing kind of responsible artificial intelligence in Microsoft.
Thank you very much, Olivier, and I appreciate a lot all my co-panelists' contribution, which gives me a little bit context in which I can explain what Microsoft has been doing over the last 2 years in this space. And I couldn't agree more with Jennifer and Matthias, and I think the City of Amsterdam is a wonderful example in how you can actually deploy AI responsibly, and we are looking at how can we develop AI responsibly. So everybody is aware of companies, the high-level group on AI of the European Commission, OECD, Council of Europe, developing AI principles. And over the last couple of years, we have been put a lot of effort in how to operationalize those principles. I want to say before I start laying this out a little bit that we also believe, as Jennifer spelled it out, there is legislation needed, there is a legislative framework needed, but we don't have it yet. And I think it's very important that companies in the meantime act responsibly. So the building blocks really of our AI, responsible AI governance, is a governance structure, a development of the standard, and then also training and scaling these efforts across all engineering groups and customer-facing sales organizations. Of course, there are a couple of topics that have had more that we have discussed a lot, such as facial recognition. We look at it also in the context of sensitive AI application, have made basically 3 distinctions. The denial of consequential services. I think this is very related to the topic that we are discussing here today. We're looking at this sort of what type of automated decision-making algorithms could potentially lead to serious consequences in the context of insurance, housing, recruitment, and the like. And these are, of course, all areas where the public sector plays a significant role. We look at a third area of sensitive use application, which is a risk of harm. Here we really think about physical but emotional harm and sectors such as health, military, but also specific vulnerable audiences such as children or such as children. The third part of sensitive use applications is really where potentially there is a significant impact on fundamental rights, privacy, of course, but also the right to assembly, freedom of expression, etc. And in these spaces, facial recognition technology and legislation around facial recognition technology has taken a lot of our attention. From a governance structure, we have, in the meantime, the last one I talk about is fairly new, developed a governance structure that is set within our senior leadership. We have a responsible Office of Responsible AI, which over those years has developed the standard, our governance standard that we are now implementing into our engineering processes. They also, of course, engage on the policy side and support legislation where we believe this is necessary. We have an ether committee. It combines our top scientists and engineering talents, and they really look at the state of the art of emerging trends in the context of responsible AI. And last, and this is a newer development, and it also shows a little bit the maturity of the governance model, is our responsible AI strategy in engineering, which basically enables engineering groups to implement responsible AI through systems and tools, meaning we are not only developing standards and processes, but we're also looking at it from a technology perspective, embedding tools into the technology, in particular when we look towards our customers to enable our customers to continue responsible AI governance. And this is really important because it's on the developing side, you need to enact and start very early on. But of course, when systems are out in the open, when they are deployed, a continuous AI governance is necessary in this space. So an interesting part in the training and scaling is that we have developed a network of AI champs. They sit in each engineering group, but also in customer-facing groups that enable others to think through that. It's a really growth mindset. It's also a mindset change that is necessary in order to start really at the very beginning and thinking about why are we actually developing this? For whom are we developing it? What are the potential negative impacts for which stakeholder group? And really starting to do this at a very early stage so that you can build out tools and mitigation processes either through contractual arrangements or in the technology development. And we have learned quite a lot because we have started to have a scaling process through our sensitive use applications. So when engineering groups or sales organization believe, oh, there is something we'd rather have the ether group, whether one of the sensitive uses might be triggered and there is potential negative impact, so that gets reviewed. And over those years, we have now sort of a bit of a case study in understanding better what type of issues can come up. And with that, we can sort of fine-tune our standards and our policies as well. What we've also learned is that, and this was also feedback we had given to the high-level group in the deep dive on the guidelines, is that our engineering groups, they like to have very precise questions and very precise tools that they can implement in those processes. So we're also getting better in fine-tuning the standard that will now be mandatory for all engineering groups. I stop here. There's certainly much more to discuss. Maybe the last point to point out, as we are developing this, we have learned from our security development lifecycle. We've also learned from GDPR compliance and implementation. And as with GDPR, as we learn and develop these tools, these standards internally, we also want our customers to benefit from those. So there is now also a lot of effort to include customers in this conversation. So with that, I stop, and I'm pretty sure there will be plenty of aspects we can discuss.
Thank you very much, Cornelia. I think we covered already quite a lot of ground in this first round. What came out from what all of you said is the question also, I think, of the transparency. I think that Matthias especially insisted on that point. But you were speaking about the transparency more on, with register, etc. But there is also the question of transparency vis-a-vis the individuals, vis-a-vis the citizens. And there is a question indeed of algorithms seen as a black box. At the same time, we know that it is not possible to explain to each an individual who is not really a specialist how the algorithm will work. So how do you address this question of having let's say a citizen with a public administration, a decision taken using algorithm, and we know there are guidelines from the European Data Protection Board on automated decision making, but how do you see that? How do we reconcile the complexity of algorithm with a necessary explanation to the citizens?
I think we can only be successful if we don't treat all algorithms alike and all these systems as they were, just one batch. But it really depends on what they are supposed to do. So first of all, one challenge, and I'm certain that, for example, Claire has experience with that, building that register for Amsterdam, is how to identify what kind of algorithmic systems are supposed to be in the register at all. Because the algorithm is everywhere. It's in your calculator. So we don't want these systems to end up in the register because, first of all, it would put a high burden on the administration itself, and it's basically useless. But we need to find a way to define what these systems are that have these consequential, that make these consequential decisions for citizens. There are many people working on this using impact assessments. We are also doing this. We are at the moment collaborating with the University of Basel and also the Canton of Zurich in Switzerland to come up with a model of how to identify those systems that would have to provide an additional, let's say, level of transparency. And then we are also producing this output of what kind of transparency they're supposed to provide. And yes, you're of course certainly correct. If we are talking about, for example, including some fairness measures in an algorithm, and they are even, machine learning based, there is basically no way to explain in detail what is going on for a layperson. But we don't think that this is necessary, because what we will be able, especially a public administration entity should be able, must be able to do, is explain to a large proportion of the affected individuals what the purpose of the system is, how, if there is such a thing, a decision-making process is being modeled, and how the system then was developed, and, for example, in collaboration with whom. So in addition to providing concrete transparency vis-a-vis the individual, saying that in this decision-making process there was automation included, we do think that we can provide a high level of transparency. This is not about explaining the machine learning system on a level that would only be understandable to computer scientists, and not even all of them, because usually only the ones who develop that specific system.
Mm-hmm. So thank you very much. And you make reference to the practical experience of GER in Amsterdam, that you want to take the floor. So how do you do, GER? Did you have experience with citizens coming back to you and about a decision taken by the city of Amsterdam, I don't know, on social benefits or mobility, etc., and saying, okay, how did you come to this conclusion? I don't understand how it, what were the factors taken into account, etc., and then how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very interesting what you said, and also what's the scope of an algorithm, and what's automated decision making. And like I said before, it's not only about algorithms, it's also about software being open so you can see what happens in the whole process, basically. So only an algorithm, I think it's well, we can think of a definition, but when you say automated decision making or decision making in general, if there are people involved or systems involved providing data, you actually want to know what data is being used by whom to make what decision, basically. And I think you can, on that level, you can actually explain every process in your organization. When you can't, you shouldn't use the technology. I mean, that's a very simple concept, I would say. Also, you need always people to look at the outcome and see what the impact is, etc. Otherwise, you get this abstract fallacy that we live in an utilitarian society with big Excel sheets that are being used to make conclusions, which works for 99% of the people, but 1% of the people has 100% of the problems. So it happens a lot, that automatic decision making, example given in providing parking permits, or decision making on what suggestions we should do to find a job, or personalized training, or probably even in providing certain benefits. But more and more we decided not to use that much technology in that domain. I mean, we did virtual exercise about matchmaking between people who were looking for a job and people who were looking for a job, and then so we used AI and see what happened with machine learning, etc. So we started to use data, profiles of people, picking them and saying, hey, you go for a job interview, you send a letter, you go for a job interview, you get the job, you get hired, and you work there after a year. So we start to collect that data basically, and based on that we start to see, can we improve the matches virtually between people who look for a job and people who actually get the job. And then you end up with well, people who are 35 are a bit chubby like myself and have a university degree. I mean, obviously they find an easy job, and even if they were white and have a Dutch name, it's even easier to get your first job interview, and all these things are correct. So when you start to use the algorithm, people probably find more jobs, especially people like myself, which is a good thing for me. A lot of people won't even get a job interview anymore. So when you start to get rid of everything it has to do with looking at content and making sure exceptions are normal, basically, and you don't go to only the standardized profiles, I mean, it will be a mess. So you shouldn't use these types of technologies, or you get rid of the parameters that are not relevant. But in this case, I mean, it matters what's your background, what's your name, what's your age, what's your skin color, so photo. It matters if you're a man or a woman. It matters if you, your university degree or your professional university or your high school degree. It actually is relevant as well, because when the people who does the job interview has an interview with you, it's relevant. People, hey, you support the same football club. That's actually relevant, or well, it's not relevant at all for the job. So actually, you end up with almost nothing on your profile, on your curriculum that's relevant for automating decision making in this perspective. So I would say a lot of times the solution is not using technology or not automating decision making, which seems like a bit like a 1910 type of solution. But I think in a lot of situations, actually, this is still the best effort, where we want to look at honesty and equal opportunities, etc. Okay.
Thank you, Geir. I don't know, Cornelia, as the company who is providing these, let's say, services and support to government, to municipalities, etc. How do you tackle this issue of, I would say, transparency, explainability? Because of course, as provider, you are the best place to provide these elements in order to, I mean, explain a decision which is taken in the end by the public administration.
First of all, I'd say we are tackling here really extremely hard questions and they are socio-technical, so you cannot only look at this as a data correlation problem. You can eventually even start saying the data is principally flawed. So there's a lot of effort in thinking through how to actually discover the problems that you're trying to solve. I think that's part of it. And we have our researchers have worked on a number of things in collaboration with, for example, the Partnership on AI, but also external researchers. And there is some tools that are now implemented, such as, for example, data sheets for data sets that provide transparency around the data that is used for developing a specific, in the context of the training, a specific training data set. There is tools that are open source that are now integrated into the systems, FairLearn and others, to provide some transparency to the user. We are also building out nodes that provide our customers the ability to understand the parameters of a specific application. So what is the use type that is good for, what it is not good for. So this type of transparency for the deployer to enable them to make the right decision in the use scenarios in which a specific tool function well. I would also say that we should always consider algorithmic tools as a tool to augment human capacities. So it's not necessarily something that should replace decisions, but should help making decisions. And I think here, that is a conversation that needs to still evolve further. People should feel empowered to use those tools, but should also feel empowered to make their own decisions. And I think that is a very, very difficult balance to which Geert could eventually talk more. And generally, we need to understand that, and our teams prefer to talk about eligibility than transparency. We also need to understand what kind of transparency we need for which purpose, which is very different when you, for example, are a municipality and procures tools, or whether you are the citizen that is at the end, at receiving end of eventually the use of such a tool. So I think these are very, very different things, and we are sort of providing the tools and technologies and guidance to our customers to enable them to build on a governance model to responsibly deploy AI, so to say.
And actually, I think Microsoft, we work quite closely lately also on these topics. So it's I mean, I think you're doing a good job, but it's also a big responsibility basically, because in the end, yes, you provide the tools basically that can, well, basically can be used for, well, to put it blunt, for mass destruction basically. So it's you have a great responsibility with these types of tools as well. So I think, at least in our collaboration, absolutely, I think you play this role, but it's we shouldn't underestimate the power that technology has nowadays in society. You see it now happening with social media platforms, example given, basically the power of algorithms and how they influence and whole groups of people. So there's a big responsibility at your side as well.
And we couldn't agree more. And by the way, just to reinforce, this is why Jennifer's contribution is so important as well, because it's really about, it's not about what we can build, but what we should build. And this question is critical. So we're really talking about the intention of the tools that we are using.
Thank you, Cornelia. And since you mentioned Jennifer, I think it would be very useful to hear your view, Jennifer, on this issue of transparency and I think explainability.
Yeah, thank you. I think the first thing to say is that transparency is potentially very useful, of course, particularly where it's to people who are overseeing the workings of an algorithmic system. But transparency isn't a goal in and of itself. It's not an end; it's a means to an end. So I think we need to consider that a lot of the problems we see with these systems aren't transparency related problems, and addressing transparency or addressing accountability or other things that tend to be the things that we discuss most won't actually address a lot of the problems that we see coming up. So so for instance, if in the UK over the summer we saw a lot of public concern about the algorithmic system that was used to assign exam grades. The pandemic meant that exams couldn't go ahead, so the government used a really quite shoddy algorithm to try to assign grades. I think it's easy to forget, but when you're 18, grades are really important. They ultimately determine like what university people go to or whether they go to university at all, and they have lots of other effects in employment and so on. But the government used an algorithmic system that was clearly not producing fair outcomes, and there was a huge public outcry and protests in the street. So that was a massive crisis about the legitimacy of using that algorithm, but it wasn't a transparency issue. It was that the system was just bad and it was being used to do something that it couldn't do, and the outcomes of it were clearly just not right, and the whole thing had been done in the wrong way. So ultimately, the government had to withdraw the system and instead assign grades based on what the students' teachers predicted they would achieve, which of course isn't perfect either, but it's a great deal better than some algorithmic bureaucracy deciding people's futures. So I think a lot of conversations about automated decision making come back to transparency and perhaps accountability, but I think transparency isn't the way to deal with these things often. It's important, but we have to be thinking about transparency's role in a much bigger kind of context, about the legitimacy and the role of automated decision making. but we absolutely do need to understand what's happening within these systems so that they can be challenged. I'm very wary of the kind of rhetoric that people who are subject to decisions need to understand how those decisions were reached, particularly when it comes to public sector automated decision making. People generally won't have much of a choice but to engage with those systems. Won't really have a choice but to be subject to those decisions. So I think we need to say, you know what, we actually need somebody who's going to protect the people rather than forcing people to understand how these systems work and try to protect themselves. But to get there, we do need to understand how the whole algorithmic process is working, not just the algorithm itself, as other people mentioned, you know, explanations or sort of technical kind of things aren't really sufficient. What we need to understand is right from the very sort of conception of the system and right through to any investigation of the consequences of the use of that system, we need sort of radical transparency right across that entire process to be able to understand what's going on. Like I say, not necessarily for individual subjective decisions, but for people who are in organisations like Algorithm Watch, or for regulators, or for the courts, to be able to look at these things and understand what's actually going on. So in our research group, we wrote a paper that's to be presented at the FACT conference in March. That's calling for reviewable automated decision making. And it's about exposing the entire algorithmic process, right from the conception of the system, as I say, right through to any investigation of the system's consequences. And that includes things like commissioning or procurement of the system. It includes things like the model development and design, and it includes the actual decision making itself, but it also includes then any auditing or investigation that goes on after that. And that's the transparency that's needed, so that regulators and courts and oversight bodies can really understand what's going on, and so we can try to protect people as best we can.
Are there any examples of organizations that actually do this 100% perfect, you know, of or at least 80% or 60% or a bit?
Not that I know of, no. There are some companies that try. I mean, so for example, you know, the model sheets or model cards thing that was mentioned. Some companies are implementing things like this, but in terms of transparency across the whole process, generally that's not really something that we see. And I think particularly when it comes to public sector automated decision making, that's a real problem. We need to remember about things like public accountability. They're really, really important. A lot of the time, companies to whom these things are contracted out to hide behind things like intellectual property, or they hide behind the complexity of these systems. But actually what we need is information about the whole process. And a lot of the time they're just simply not giving it.
Yeah, we actually really had there was an interesting lawsuit with a national tax authority. One of the directors was in court, and he literally said, actually, I don't understand this algorithm. Actually, nobody understands really what this algorithm was, but it works, so we use it. And I think this is happening all the time. It works. We have 70% improvement. We have 20% improvement. There's improvement of what nobody knows, but and this happens again and again and again. So we really should make sure we find ways to oppose these people in their well, I would say simplified thinking.
I think the point I would make is that it's not always necessary to actually understand the algorithm itself. A lot of the time, that's kind of incidental. If you want to assess whether automated decision making is being used in compliance with, like, you know, sort of principles of human rights or whatever, then a lot of the time you don't need to know what the algorithm is doing. What you need to know is those broader processes of why was it commissioned, what were the decisions made by people in designing it and implementing it. Those are the things that are really, I think, most important, and the things that we need to be looking towards when it comes to transparency in this space.
Okay, thank you very much. I think one of the key points you made is about this transparency, which is not a full understanding of the algorithm, but a comprehension of the process, let's say, from the beginning to the end. So indeed, I mean, from your point of view, when AI systems are developed and put to use, especially by I would say public authorities, but probably also by private entities, how do you see how to ensure their acceptability by the citizen? Do you need an ex ante, let's say, examination of the systems before they are put on the market? A kind of let's say supervision, how to ensure the supervision while they are operating, and then a system of let's say correction of the effects on citizens. would you structure, let's say, this supervision, this management of this AI system by public authorities?
I think from my point of view, we need to have sort of regulatory oversight of this, and it needs to be quite close oversight of this. There needs to be some kind of authority actually looking at that whole process, not even necessarily looking at the algorithm itself, although in some cases that will of course be relevant, but looking at the whole process to understand what kind of values and goals are being encoded into that process. That's, for me, is one of the most important things. So I talked about the example of the exams algorithm that was used in the UK over the summer. And I think when it comes to something like this, it wasn't the transparency of that system that affected the public perception of kind of the legitimacy of it. It was whether decisions seemed to be arbitrary or sort of capricious or just fundamentally unfair. And I think questions like that, when it comes to public perceptions, are much more important than things like transparency. I think transparency is useful, but we need to make sure that systems are actually designed properly. And it's that systems aren't being used to do things they shouldn't be used to do, and that systems aren't being implemented with the wrong goals and the wrong values encoded in them. I think really legitimacy and questions like that, it comes down to questions of really just the fundamental public values. It's no different, I think, to any other sort of public decision making. As long as there is a regulator overseeing what's happening and the right values are being implemented in the right way, and things don't seem unfair or arbitrary, then I think people are willing to accept things as long as it's done properly.
Thank you. I don't know. I think that Matthias, it would be good also if you share your view on this. And I'm referring, in fact, to question asked by the public, and I thank the people who are putting their question. How to let's say ensure this supervision? I mean, ex ante supervision when of the use of the system. I mean, means of redress after a decision has been taken. What is your view on this let's say issue? Because at the same time you need to ensure the easy use of AI system. I mean, not to have something too burdensome, but you need this very close supervision, especially when it has consequences, for instance, in the field of health, of tax, or employment, social benefit, etc.
Well, first of all, it has already been said that especially the public sector is not working or operating in some kind of vacuum. So there is a lot of regulation there already that tries to guarantee that decisions that are made by public sector entities are following the rule of law, and you need to justify the purpose of what is going on. Of course, that differs massively from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but the principle is always the same. There needs to be accountability. The question is it actually there in practice? And this is, I think, what we are discussing mainly here, because no one would doubt or argue that this accountability sort of disappears when some computer systems are being used. I mean, this is what we're talking about. They have been used for decades in the public sector, and with expert systems and all these things, we had discussions like this before. But it would be ludicrous to argue, this whole process of providing accountability and following the rule of law doesn't exist anymore just because we have some algorithms in there. Now, when it comes to this question that many of you asked, I think we are on the same level or on the same page when we are arguing that, yes, one of the important issues to make transparent, the important things to make transparent, is the purpose and the goals of the systems. Why are they being used at all? Now, if this only happens once a system has already been deployed by the public sector, then we can see examples like the one with the grading algorithm in the UK, but also with the so-called AMS algorithm that is being used in Austria, trying to assign qualification measures to unemployed. That is highly contested and apparently, highly discriminatory. So what we do need to think about is also developing a better way to discuss what purposes these systems should be used for at all, and whether they are fit for this purpose. How we can do that is at the moment not quite clear, because again, there is a process for that in the public sector. They can't just go and say, you know, now we completely rearrange the system that we already have, and without any kind of accountability, do whatever they prefer, because there's a higher efficiency. But from case to case, we just have to question that this is being done properly, because we see these quite negative consequences. So I think that is something that we need to work on. It's too late if we only always say we need to find out about what the system is supposed to do once it has already been deployed.
Thank you very much, Matthias. I mean, looking at the question received also in the chat, there is one directed to you, Cornelia, about it's specifically about the use of artificial intelligence in healthcare, and asking, you know, should it be always considered as a high risk? But I will make the question a bit more general also. I mean, how to classify? I mean, is there any reflection on your side on this division, high risk, not high risk? And as I said in the Commission reflection, and this was in the AI white paper, there is indeed this big question of you know, at the same time, you don't want to stifle innovation and prevent certain use of AI. At the same time, you have to be very careful with the high risk system. So where to put the cursor there?
Yes, so Microsoft has responded to the white paper. We appreciate very much the opportunity and have, with a lengthy paper, provided some thoughts. I was eventually a little bit surprised to see only one category of risks, while a lot of contributions before have had a myriad of risks, maybe eventually too complicated. And Microsoft, in the way we have built out our responsible AI governance, we think about sensitive uses versus a risk denominator, and makes sense to have a little bit of the distinction between those automated processes that can lead to denial of consequential services that we discussed mainly here. I think these are key in the public sector use. All the examples that we discussed here would fall into this category, while risks in the context of health is certainly often related to harm. I'd say, of course, the health sector also uses AI in areas that are not related to the patient, so we might want to make a distinction here. And the health sector is also highly regulated, and we'll have to see how the safety requirements will expand and integrate AI applications here. I think this is already a starting process and makes total sense. There is guidance, for example, in the United States along these lines, and I'm pretty sure that the health sector will also play a critical role in the continuous discussion within the European Commission. So largely we believe that these are related to harms and safety and liability, safety and risks and reliability, while the issues that we discussed here largely discrimination, bias, and fairness really is a result fair in the eyes of the public and the citizens.
Thank you, Cornelia. If I may ask, maybe all of you, I mean, the three of you who have not spoken about this question of high risk or even forbidden use of AI. I mean, do you see, you know, 2-3 uses where you would consider that either they should be completely forbidden or they would be high risk? I mean, I don't know, maybe we start with you, Ger, because you have said that in some instances you have decided not to use automated decision making or AI? Is it because, well, it doesn't work, then it's better not to use it? Don't use something which doesn't work, which was basically what you said. Or do you consider that some of them, it was too risky, and then you take the decision, no, I mean, this is something where AI has not its place?
No, absolutely. I mean, in many ways, I would say, but also many cases, we don't use AI. I mean, we do use algorithms, obviously, and you do decision making basically, but putting in a self-learning component or learning component in it, I mean, so in everything it has to do with the job market and matchmaking, etc. But we actually don't use AI at the moment, and also for traffic management, etc. A few fields where we don't do this because we see that the effect actually is not what you want to have, basically, because then you can put in coincidence in an algorithm, or you can put in other things in an algorithm, but for many ways, actually, we don't know the effect yet. So the only way to learn is also to do it parallel and then do research. What if you start to put in more intelligence in your decision making? What is the role? How can you do the checks and balances? How can you make sure it's auditable? How can you make sure it's that you comply with rules and regulations? How can you make sure that people actually understand what's happening, basically? So I think when you actually start to use real intelligence in your decision making, it's mandatory to make sure you do research first, and parallel to that, make sure you have checks and balances on using this. And the other thing is, I would say we shouldn't ignore the opportunities as well, obviously. So you need to do that research. You need to test. You need to see how you can, because probably we can work more effective, more efficient, etc. And that's a good thing. Yes, I'm a technology optimist, but we really need to make sure that people take their responsibility, make sure there's enough checks and balances in everything we do.
Okay. Thank you, Ger. Matthias, if you were, let's say, advising, I mean, the legislator, what would be the AI application that you would definitely forbid or put on the blacklist, and those who are kind of high risk with very strong safeguards? I mean, do you have any recommendation there?
Well, I actually do. I mean, in general, we argue very similar to what Fer just said. There is no ex ante clarity on what actually is a high-risk system and what is not a high-risk system. I think you have to do this assessment on a case-by-case basis. Now, whether it is still a good idea to define some domains, as for example the Commission did in the white paper. Let's take for example, use of automated decision-making or AI-based systems in the workplace, saying that this is in general considered to be high risk. So there are some requirements that need to be fulfilled. You know, I'm sympathetic to that. Still, you know, it's still to be discussed. But doing or making such an assessment on a case-by-case basis, then one of the examples where this basically comes to the conclusion that it's a very, very bad idea and it should be banned is the use of live facial recognition in public places. This is where we also joined a statement by EDRI, European Digital Rights, and many other organizations saying that this should actually be banned. Because here, in that specific case, you can say that the risk of this being used for surveillance on a very, very broad and general level is so high that it trumps all, you know, ideas of using this for good, you know, be it crime prevention or whatever, that basically on balance, it should be banned.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Jennifer?
Yeah, thank you.
Also, I mean, this forbidden and the high risk. I mean, what would be your 2 or 3 sectors?
I think it's difficult to say necessarily 2 or 3 sectors. I think virtually, I mean, you can probably say that virtually anything in delivering public services or healthcare should rightly be considered to be high risk because the consequences are potentially very serious. But I think more generally, we kind of need a framework for understanding this, and sort of rather than saying that sector's high risk, that sector's high risk, that sector's high risk, you need a framework where you can integrate things like the impact on human rights, including socioeconomic rights, whether it's processing special category data, whether it's making decisions that are about things that are particularly impactful on people's lives, whether it's making decisions about people who are potentially particularly vulnerable, those kind of things. And then you can try to work out on the basis of those things whether a particular set of decisions is likely to be high risk or not, rather than necessarily saying particular sectors are high risk. We do have a paper coming out hopefully on this later this year that will set out a framework for assessing the risk of different kinds of systems. So hopefully that'll be later this year, so look out for that. But I just want to come back very quickly to the point that was made about the risks of stifling innovation by categorizing things as high risk, or by sort of preventing certain kinds of systems from being used, or whatever. But I think actually, to some extent, we do want to stifle innovation here. The public sector shouldn't be a testing ground for new technologies. It should be where things that are tried and tested and known to work can be deployed. Innovation is one thing in the private sector, but it's something else entirely, I think, in the public sector, where consequential decisions can have very serious effects on people's lives. I think generally we treat the concept of innovation far more critically than we often do. Not all new ideas are the purpose of law and regulation is to try to distinguish between the two and actually stifle the one that is harmful or negative for society. I also think we should reject the idea that the public sector should be run like the private sector. At the minute, too much of automation and digitalization is driven by things like efficiency and cost saving, and by an uncritical approach to innovation. Businesses are concerned with profit. Governments should be concerned with the general welfare, with public good, with human rights, including socioeconomic rights, with public accountability, with equality and non-discrimination, with fairness, with good administration, and with the rule of law. And if new technologies can't be used in a way that upholds those values, then innovation simply has to take a back seat, and government should try something else.
Thank you very much. I mean, indeed, this question of classification of AI uses is something which is highly debated. It was mentioned, as you rightly said, in the white paper. There's been a lot of comments. The question is really, and I think this is an ongoing debate, is whether things should be banned completely from the start, or you mentioned as well this case-by-case assessment, and then indeed it's also the question of accountability, which is then entering into question. So the question is, what do you leave to the accountability, and what do you leave also to the application of data protection? Because the data protection rules, the framework existing in the EU already sets a very strict framework. Matthias, you mentioned, for instance, facial recognition in public spaces. Obviously, this would, as highlighted in the white paper, only possible in the EU if you have a national legislation, for instance, in place, because consent would not be a possibility there. So indeed, the question there is how to go further than what is already prescribed in the national legislation. You also mentioned, I think, a very important point that was mentioned, I think, by Cornelia. I'm not quite sure who said it, but it was very relevant. I thought it was the fact that what we aim, I think, with this AI legislation is to make sure that the existing rights or the existing legislation are properly enforced also in the AI system. The non-discrimination already exists. The data protection, the fundamental rights, the freedom of expression, all that already exists. So the question is how to implement the principle of accountability and the principle, let's say, of explainability in order to be able to properly implement in the AI sector the fundamental rights that are there in the EU, also based on the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So I think this is really the big debates which is ongoing. So I recall that we are coming to the end of this panel. And I would like, first of all, to thank very much the panelists for their insightful remarks. It's a bit frustrating because we have to finish, and I had a few questions more. But I would thank very much you, the four of you, and I would like to thank very much the audience for listening and for sending questions as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.